Hey guys, so today I'm going to cover how to set up TDS for a multi-project solution. For those that have never used TDS, TDS stands for Team Development for Sitecore. It's built by Hedgehog Development. It's actually technically called TDS Classic now because they've extended their line to other product offerings. But TDS is a great tool for getting changes in Sitecore, bring them down to your local file system as serialized items of some form, and then being able to check those changes into source control, which is important if you're working, like the name suggests, team development. If you're working with a team of developers, either just one or two developers, or even a large, massive team like 20 developers, TDS is very helpful with that, because if you've just recently built some Sitecore templates that relate to maybe building an article or a blog, that you can sync those with your local file system, check them into source control, and then with the fact that all the other developers on your team are also using TDS, they can get latest, be able to sync those changes or deploy those changes to their local environment and have the same changes that you have. So all the code that depends on those templates would also work as well. So that's where TDS is very helpful. So typically, if you're going to be working with TDS, you're probably going to be setting up a multi-project TDS installation. So what do I mean by multi-project? I mean that you're going to have a TDS.master and a TDS.core at the very minimum. So core will represent changes that are in the core database, whereas master would represent changes that are in the master database. I also have seen other instances where you have a TDS content. So this is basically a split between the master database. They both reference the master database, but one references TDS.master generally references templates, settings, layouts, and things like that. Whereas the TDS content would represent media library changes and things that are in the past Sitecore/content. So to get started with this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and start creating some of these projects. So to do that, I am assuming that you've already installed TDS on your local environment. In this instance, I'm using a trial version. You could also do that as well. You can get a 30-day trial license for TDS for free. If you're already using it, you've installed it already probably, but if you're installing for the first time, you need to make sure that you download the latest version, and then you also need to make sure that that you're installing the version. There's going to be multiple exes inside the zip file that you download, and inside that will be ones for the different versions of Visual Studio. So if you have 2017 Visual Studio, you need to make sure that you install that version of TDS for that version. So having said that, I've already gone through that process. I've installed TDS, downloaded it, installed it 2017 because I'm using Visual Studio 2017 Community Edition. So Community versus Enterprise doesn't matter in this instance. So that's generally the steps that are needed. So once you have done that, you can go add from your solution, add new project, and then you should see these options for additional types of projects, which TDS project is one of those. So I'm going to go ahead and create a TDS core. Which now you can see some very simple examples of some of the settings it has. I'm also going to create a new project for TDS.master. And so now you have these two projects. Now, one thing you want to avoid is having, especially if you were building a Helix implementation, this is just using a more standard approach. But if you have multiple projects in your solution, you don't really want to have multiple settings that are the same between these projects, or even the same between different types of configurations that you have configured multiple times in the different projects. So there's actually a way that you can get around this, and that's actually what I'm going to show in this tutorial. For this tutorial, I'm only going to assume that we have debug and release. If you have multiple configurations for your environment, such as a CI, a local, maybe a production or a UAT stage, something like that, you could create additional configurations and configure TDS to work with those additional configurations depending on what settings you want it to have, depending on those configurations. So I think the best way to get started with this is to actually go ahead and just start configuring one of the projects. So I'm going to start configuring one of the projects. You can right click on TDS.master and click properties. And then we'll kind of go through all these tabs describing what they are and where they might be useful. So the general tab is a really kind of prerequisite that you have to kind of configure this. So the source web project is going to be your website or your web project inside your solution. So if you select web, which I already have configured, it will automatically kind of fill in these additional boxes. The Sitecore database is the database that you're syncing with, so that's where these two projects are going to differ. One's pointing to the master, and the other one's pointing to the core. You can exclude assemblies and some other changes. You can deploy items that have changed after a certain date. You can manage Sitecore roles in TDS, things like that. I'm going to kind of leave those alone for now. So I'm going to save that change. There's a concept of code generation. I'm actually going to do a second part on this video, probably in this same week, where I kind of cover the code generation steps of basically once you've got TDS configured, you can code generate glass models from TDS. There's probably a way you can also generate other types of models, but glass is the most common way of code generation. So I'll show kind of these steps once we get to talking about that part. Multi-project properties is if you want to build, let's say you have master items that depend on stuff in the core, you can actually check this option, and then these things are deployed and packaged together typically. So that's where these settings come into play. Same with packaged bundling. If you're building a TDS package for deployment to production, you could package the TDS core into that package as well as the master. So I'm not going to change any of those settings because we're not really going to cover that in this session. Next is environment validation. This is a feature that will kind of cover if your current Sitecore instance has certain packages installed, so you can verify that before you do any sort of deployment that it has web forms markers, or maybe you want a clean slate package in there and you want to make sure that all the items are deleted before you start installing new packages or deploying new Sitecore items to your local instance. So this is where you can kind of create some configuration for that. The next one is build. This is by far the most important one that you're going to configure, and I'm going to really be talking about this one the most. So what I'm going to do is just configure it for my local environment. So HP instance.local is the website that we're going to be working with, which is this one right here. This has got already some Sitecore items configured in it, and we'll use it for configuration and just kind of demoing some of the features of TDS. And next, you'll need to point to the Sitecore deploy folder. This is where your Sitecore instance actually lives. So if we go to this PC and we go to the C drive, Sitecore, and instance website, click OK. And then lastly, a very important feature that we'll kind of demonstrate the real power of here in a second is the recursive deploy action. This kind of sounds scary. Ignore Sitecore items not in the project, which is typically what I see in most instances. So if you have other items in there, it won't do anything with them that are not in source control. But I think what you really need to do, especially if you're going to set up a CI environment where you're going to be publishing changes from your local environment, once you check them in, they're going to automatically publish and update your CI or dev environment with everybody's changes, you don't want things that have been deleted from source control to still be there and not be deleted. So there's kind of two options for that last part. You can delete the items, just plain out delete them, or you can move them to the Sitecore recycling bin. I actually think you probably should just remove them and put them into this recycling bin, because if there's any situation where somebody accidentally deletes something that they shouldn't have, and the parent are set to publish all children, then you might have lost all your changes without being any way of really recovering those, except for maybe rolling back the change set or whatever it may be. So I'm going to select move Sitecore items not in the project to the Sitecore recycling bin, and we'll kind of show this in a little bit as well. I'm going to leave the disable file deployment unchecked. Lastly, I'm going to select install Sitecore connector, so it's going to automatically generate a key. This key is used for there's a kind of a service that's installed in your Sitecore instance, and for security reasons, you don't want any service to be able to, let's say, for example, if somebody had set this up in a CM environment or even a production environment, although I wouldn't recommend having this service running in your production environment, but let's say you get careless and you accidentally let it deploy to a production environment. If it didn't require some sort of key to verify that you're that person that should have the rights to access it, then anybody could sync or even pull Sitecore items from this service. So to prevent that, they've created this concept of access GUID, which is just something that's configured so it kind of prevents people from accessing the service without having permissions. So once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and save, and now I'm just going to test. And so this is just going to go through all the steps of syncing with that service, and it's going to set up and install TDS connector and verify the access GUID is correct with the service. And at the end, you'll get an all tests passed. So I'll just click close. So everything is ready to go, but I'm going to show a few other scenarios here in a second. But let's continue down these tabs. So the update package is related to deployments. So if you're looking to get into CI or even in a production environment, you could set it up to generate a package once you deploy the project. And this would create, depending on its configuration, it would create a update package that you would run at the URL basically /sitecore/admin update installation wizard.aspx. Basically using the update wizard that comes with Sitecore for Sitecore updates, you would use for your TDS package updates. This allows you to roll back things and things like that as well. Also, it creates a kind of an easier interface for installing your packages. But there's options in here. If you select this option, it will basically give you an option to either package all the compiled code as well as all the items, or you could split it up into just the compiled code or just the items in your instance. I typically generally use the build server to manage the compiled code, whereas the items would be handled by this TDS package. So once it creates a package, you could set up some automated steps where it would install the package, such as Sitecore ship or some other open source framework, or you could there's other tools out there that you could use for that. So, or you can manually do it as well. So I also generally want to append the current date and time to the package name, just so you have a reference of, okay, I deployed 6:10 at 4:05 p.m. So then you could use that package in the future if you find that you need to reinstall it for any reason. You know what packages were created at what dates. The next one is the deploy. This allows you to actually configure additional actions. So you can publish after build, which is a very popular one. So once after that, so you can actually create a deploy package that once it's been installed, it would actually trigger a publish on the website. You could also have it trigger an update link database, and you could also customize these with additional options as well. So, so that's some options there. You can do a NuGet package. This is kind of a new feature I haven't really used that much, but you could generate a new NuGet package, and this could be used in your, for example, this could be used in your CI deployments, if continuous integration deployments. Validations is if you enable, you can actually prevent certain scenarios from happening. So the one I explained a second ago is what if somebody deletes something, or what if they change the deployment configuration so it accidentally says, delete all the templates. You could actually configure validations that would prevent that from occurring. So you can actually use some of the pre-built ones here, ones where they will just show a warning or it will show errors. I can't seem to scroll there for some reason, but you could also define additional some additional validations as well if you want to build custom ones. And I don't know why it's asking me to save, but I'll just save that. And then the project report, this is kind of another new feature. So if you want to create reports after you've triggered a deploy, so it shows you what it's done or things that it's done, you can do that as well. And lastly is file replacement. This is a common use if you have some sort of CI and you have, let's say your configurations are not using transformations, like using slow cheetah to handle those transformations. You could have different folders for all your configuration changes depending on, so if you had release or debug selected, those configurations could alter based on these file replacements that you could configure. That's one example. There's other examples as well as things you could do. So we've pretty much configured our TDS.master. We've got some code generation, or we don't have any code generation, but we have general and we have the build configured. So I'm going to make sure that's saved, and now I'm going to close that. So there's things that are in that TDS master that we're really going to want inside a TDS core as well. So typically when you have this set up, you're going to want some sort of global config that will be used to share information between these two. There's also another benefit of using a global config is because if you click on here and you go to the build step, right now anybody can change these variables, and I found that with working with a lot of developers forget to check this option, which I'm going to show here in a minute about the .user file and how that alters and allows for user specific configurations. But I found a lot of people come in here and they change this, and they shouldn't be. It would be really nice if this was locked out from being changed. So to create a global configuration file, TDS has already kind of thought about that and created a way that we can create that. So if you go up to the solution, right click, and you click add global TDS config file, it's actually going to go ahead and do that for you. And you'll notice it's full of XML. It's all example XML. I'm just going to remove all this for now because I'm just going to fill this in from our TDS master project that we just configured. It's a great way to configure this if you already have something to reference. So now that we have that configured, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on TDS master and I'm going to unload the project. So now you're able to access the actual XML behind the project. So if I click edit that project, now we'll see that there's actually 3 configurations in this one. There's a release, which I haven't configured yet, the debug, which I configured a few seconds ago, and then there's a generic one, which would be settings that would be carried over between release and debug. So this is actually something I like to also configure in our global. So what I would like to do is just copy this, and I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to add this in. And I'm going to leave most of these settings in place as well. Some of these we might want to move as well into different configurations, or we might want to just leave as the global configurations for all the different release versus debug, or if you have multiple configurations, this is where this could become really powerful. So we'll go back to TDS.master, And now we're going to start moving some of these things some of these need to be shared with the release configuration as well. And some of these could be global to any configuration or any projects that you set up. So the first one is the output path. This is pretty obvious. If I control exit, this one is also part of the release. I'm just going to go into the TDS global and I'm just going to paste this in. So just to clarify what I'm doing right now. So if you have in your global TDS debug selected, so basically if you have debug selected up here, any projects that use the debug mode would use this setting. And then up here is all, if you don't, it doesn't matter what you have selected, any projects that reference or will reference the global will use these settings up here. So I want obviously these to be different, so I'm just going to set, if configuration is released, then the output path is release. If the configuration is debug, then the output path is debug. So let's go back here, debug symbols. So this relates to when you build. Release typically doesn't debug symbols, whereas debug would debug symbols. That's a tongue twister right there. So let's go back and just paste this option in both. So debug symbols on debug will be true, and then release will be false. And make sure you remove these as well, because if you have configuration in a specific project, it will overwrite anything you configure in your global config. So just something to keep in mind. So recursive deploy action and the Sitecore web URL, install Sitecore connector. Let's just move all those to let's move those all into the actual overall every config. So they won't actually exist because we want the Sitecore web URL to be used by all projects, all configurations. Actually, that's not totally true. We want the deploy action to be used by all configurations and all projects, but we don't want the URL to be used by all configurations. So this, we might want a different configuration for release. So we could call this release instead. Just so when we start testing these, when we start reloading the project and testing these, you'll see that these are being pulled in differently depending on where you place them. And the same for this, we want this to be kind of different depending on the configuration, but we want it to be global across the core of the master. So I'm just going to leave them the same in this instance, but they would typically be different in your depending on your environment. The Sitecore access GUID and basically these last three options will be global. And I'm going to just remove this because we already have that configured. So if I go here, I'm going to have, these are going to be global. So this access GUID would be used by all projects, by all configurations. You may find that you want the access GUID to be different depending on the environment, especially if you want to prevent certain developers from accessing certain environments. But for this, we're just going to keep it all in there. So that's pretty much it. Instance.web, we're going to want in every instance. So one thing I'm going to go and do is I'm going to actually remove all this because this is always already configured in our global config. And then we could have validations as well specific to the environment. So what I can do is move this as well. So what you might find is you actually have hardly any configurations in your actual individual project configs, and all of it's kind of configured in your global. So this would be dependent on the environment. So debug, instead of debug, it'd be release. And that is that. So one issue I found when I was kind of demonstrating this to myself, preparing for this video, is that by default, I can reload this and it still won't completely work correctly. It's not pulling in all the information. So what I found is I had to actually close Visual Studio and restart it. So let's do that. Save changes. And now I'm going to restart my instance testing project. And there we go. So now we should find in the TDS.master all those settings have actually carried over. So everything we set inside TDS master is now showing up in this individual configuration based on our debug or our configuration that we selected. So as you remember, instance.local is configured for debug, and we actually have instance release configured for release. So if we click release, you'll see that it changes. Also, another thing that you'll notice is that I can't actually type anything now. It's kind of locked out this field. And actually, if you click or hover over this globe, it actually tells you why it's kind of disabled. So this actually is great because now any developer can't just come in here and change this without creating their own user files. So if I wanted to change the let's use the core project as an example. So we'll go over the core, and you'll notice that all the settings are here as well, which is great. So now we want to start making some changes. And I want to start showing you some of the configuration things that you can do, especially in a very large multi-project solution. So let's say you're in a small one, like the one we're in now, and a developer is like, okay, well, this isn't my URL. Let's go to debug real quick. So in their local environment, for some reason, the developers are not standardizing their local environments. But let's say developer A is using instance.local, and then developer B is using instance.dev, for example. So this wouldn't work for them. They'd be like, well, I can't sync my Sitecore items. So what they would need to do now is click on Edit User Specific Configuration. When they check that option, actually asked me to save, so save the option, and then when I click this option, what it's going to do is create a .user file for this project. So if I change this to instance.dev and save the change, it's going to uncheck this option. I wish it actually kept it checked because it would make it more obvious to the user that this isn't using a global configuration anymore, although the globe has actually disappeared. So this kind of makes it obvious in some ways. It makes it obvious that this is not a global configuration change. This is now a instance specific configuration. But also when you click that .user, it's actually gone ahead and create a if we go into the TS core, which we're editing, you'll notice it actually created a .user file. So typically with TFS or with Git, you're going to want to exclude or not even commit or add the files that end with .user. So these configurations are specific to this user and this user alone. But one issue that you may have already noticed is that I only made it to this project. If I went to this project, it would still say instance.local, which is not good. Which is fine in a smaller project because you might go, well, all I need to do is, right click on this project, click edit, and then change this one as well. But imagine if you're using a Helix-based solution. You might have 50 features, and each of those features has a TDS project. But there's a way you can get around this. So if I go back to the core, I'm going to go ahead and actually delete that. Well, actually, wait, let's not do that. Let's just go ahead and create a new .user file. This is just something I kind of stumbled upon. I haven't seen any tutorials talking about this, but what you can do is actually create a .user file for your global config as well. So if you go up here and click Add, and you click New Item, There's really not any .user file, so what I can do is just call it TDS global config .local, or actually .user is what it's called, and click add. And it's going to complain a little bit, but don't worry about it. It's actually going to work. Don't worry. And now you have a user specific file. So what you could do is just copy. That didn't work right. See, Control A, and copy this file, and then just move it over here. And now you can start making changes to it that are specific to this environment. So what I want to do is really just remove this property altogether. And I'm only going to want to make changes for this user, for this specific user, to this one file. So to these specific configurations. So for lease, I'm not going to change anything. But for debug, I'm going to want to change instance.local to instance global thing. So I saved that change, and now you notice these projects now aren't available. It actually unloaded those projects, so I can actually reload them now. So reload and reload. So now if we right click on the properties of core, you'll notice that I used it in dev. Hold on one second. Let me make sure I got this. So core's got its own local. Should be pulling. Now you'll notice that it's using this icon, so it's now a global plus a person. So the way it works is the global is used by default, but if you have project specific configuration that are user specific, it will overwrite your user specific global config, or even your user specific or non-user specific global config. So if you have any user specific configs in your projects, they're going to always overwrite anything up here in the TDS global. Whereas if we load up the TDS.master, you'll notice that because we didn't create any project specific configuration for the user for the TDS.master project, it's going to load the user config from the global area. So it's actually pulling in the setting. So it's a pretty cool feature. A lot of people don't know that you could probably do that. So if you're working with a Helix implementation, your best bet is to create the TDS.global and then to create a TDS.global.config.user per developer. So obviously a developer should not ever check this file in, but it should be excluded always. But each developer could create their own .user file that's at the global level, and then they can make changes that will affect all the projects. So they don't have to go in and manually make changes to all the different projects in a Helix-based implementation, or even a large where there's maybe 5 TDS projects. They can just make it all in that .user file in the global area. If you are wanting to make the change to TDS.core and you don't want to make it on the project layer in that .local file or .user file, and you want it to kind of pull from the user, all you have to do is go back to your file system and delete this user file. So, and you would obviously have to reload your project also. And reload the project. Quick properties, and it looks like I might have to restart Visual Studio for this as well. Sometimes I think it caches some of this stuff and it doesn't always release it, so you need to just restart instance testing solution. So now we're gonna open up our properties for TDS core, and now you'll notice that it's pulling in the global. If you ever make a configuration with all these configurations and it doesn't seem to make any differences, you might want to just restart Visual Studio. Like I said, it caches things, and that can cause a lot of confusion when you're configuring all these config files. But just if you've watched this video and you're following examples from this video, you should be able to do all those things. There might be older versions of TDS where this might not always work perfectly, but in this version, which I think I'm running 5.6, some miscellaneous smaller version of that, 2.5.6 or 5.6.0159 or something like that, then as long as you're close to that, you should have no problem configuring anything that I've configured so far. So you'll notice that it's configured everything. One thing that it didn't configure that we actually need to make a change to is in the TS Global. We're actually going to need to make sure that the database is different per project. So this is actually something that we wouldn't be able to configure up here. In this global config, you'd actually have to go down to the projects and configure it here. So, and of course you could do this through the editor as well. That's up to you. So I'm looking for, let's just paste this, Sitecore. Looks like it's not in this. So the core selected, so I'll just change this to core. And then here I will edit this and I will change the, I actually deleted it, I shouldn't have. Edit. And I'll just pull this. It's just complaining. And I'm going to change this to master. And you may want to also change this, obviously, ts.master, master, master, make it specific to this environment. But you get basically the idea here. So when I reload these projects, I'm just going to close some of this configuration I have set up. Let's just close all documents. So now if you go back to master, you'll see that master is selected and core is selected. So that's just that change that we just made. So now that that's done, you've got basically your configuration set up. Now let's talk about how to get Sitecore items into your projects. So inside TDS.master is really the only project we're going to work with today, because core I don't actually have any items currently in there. So let's work with a master. So to get items, the very first thing you'll ever do with a TDS project is just get Sitecore items. So click that, and I think I didn't change anything with my configuration, but I might have a global pointing to the wrong environment. So this isn't working because the build is pointing to instance global.local, which what I really wanted to point to is actually maybe just removing this altogether. So I'll delete that. And then if I unload this project, and then reload it, properties. Now it's showing instance.local because it's not using the user specific global, it's using just the global, which the global just specifies instance.local for debug. For release, it points to instance release. So now we should be able to right click and click on get Sitecore items. And now it will show you your local instance. So under templates, what we're going to just do is we're going to pull in all the templates that are underneath instance. Instance is just the name I've given my Sitecore instance. So it's important to kind of group all your Sitecore changes into some, one, or it could be multiple folders, as long as it's easy to determine which one they are. If they're scattered throughout all over your tree, you're going to have to configure a lot. You might have issues with losing items that you don't want to lose because you have to change all your configuration. And 3, it's just a lot easier to do it this way. So under instance, I have all these folders. What I want to do is I just want everything under instance. So I could right click on this folder and say select all children. And now I'll just click get all items. So basically it's going to go out to my Sitecore instance and pull all these items, serialize them, and create these serialized versions or items of my Sitecore tree, which I'll show here, right here. So if I go to TDS.master, it's gone into Sitecore, templates, and basically it's creating this .item file. And this .item file is what you would commit into source control. So if we go back, now you'll see that it actually is also represented in a project. So all that is there. One other thing to show is if we right click on this, we can see deployment property manager. This is a way to see how each folder is configured. So if I click on this item, it's set to synchronize all children within it. So the way we've set our project is that we set it to always deploy, and if it finds new items, it's actually set to delete those items. So if you have this option selected, all children, and you've configured that option where it deletes items that are not in source control, it will delete those items or add them to the recycling bin in this instance. If you change this option to not sync all children, it won't delete things that aren't in source control, which I'll show here in a second, just a demonstration of that. So what I can do, and just to clarify, you can actually exclude configuration to different configurations as well. So that's also something to keep in mind. So there's all these different options down here of different configurations that you can configure depending on your environment. So it doesn't have to be just debug or just release, or right now we're actually configuring for all the different configurations. So right now it's all children. So let's demonstrate what's going to happen if I create a new template in one of these folders. So if I go down to folders and I right click folders and create a new template, and I'll just call it don't delete me. And I'm just going to give it a base template of base. So now it's created this don't delete me template item. Everything in Sitecore is an item. So now if we go back to Visual Studio and we were to deploy this TDS.master project, it will actually delete that file. So, or not delete it, but move it to the recycling bin. So if we right click and we go to deploy, it will attempt to deploy everything that's in this folder to Sitecore. And then if it finds new items that are in Sitecore and not in the project, it will delete those items from Sitecore or move them to a recycling bin, depending on your option. Although if you have the option of just ignoring those in this configuration, recursive deploy action, then it will also leave those files. So just keep that in mind when you're configuring these. But if we refresh the folders, you'll notice that don't delete me is gone. Oh no. But we're going to actually go ahead and restore it real quick. So we'll go over the Launchpad, recycling bin, and you'll now see it's actually in the don't delete me. Don't delete me is in the recycling bin. So I'm just going to restore that just to demonstrate how to disable the deletion of that. So back to Visual Studio, and now we're going to right click on the instance like we did before, go to Deployment Property Manager, and now we're going to change the option to synchronize all children, and we're going to change this to none. You could also set this to synchronize direct descendants. So if you had, this would not work in this, well, it would work in this instance because the direct descendants of the instance folder is just base content folders, pages, and renderings. Now, if we had another folder in there and we had direct descendants selected, it would delete that folder unless it was in source control. Whereas any folder underneath, because there are multiple children's deep, it will leave those items because you're only selected direct descendants. It also depends on the settings of all these other folders as well. So if they have settings of all children, it will delete those as well. So it's something to keep in mind when you're configuring this. So I'm going to select it to none. You'll notice that all children is also selected for all these other projects. So I'm going to go into folders and change this to none as well. So, or same as parent. So it's actually going to, if it finds that don't delete me item, it's not going to delete it with this configuration. So just like that, and then deploy. And I'm running 5.6.0.15 if you're curious what version I'm running. So we'll go back, Launchpad, Content Editor, Templates, Instance, Folders, and now you'll see that your don't delete me item is still there because we've changed the configuration to not delete those items. Now where does this come into play? In the templates, in your layouts, in your settings, things like that, you're probably going to want all children of all items underneath so that those are always tracked through source control. When you're deploying this stuff to your CI, you want it to delete those templates that don't exist. So you're going to want all that configured like that. But you're not going to want that in the case of content. So if you wanted to keep all your content in place, but you didn't want it to be in source control, with this option, you would just make sure either A, you haven't synced the item content, which is the case in our instance. So since we have master synced, we don't have the content part of the tree in source control, but since it's not set to automatically do all children of every item in the tree, it's not going to delete those items. But if we were to do a get Sitecore item and do content and just do just a content folder, get items, and then we were to configure in the deployment property manager, just configure it to child item sync none, because we didn't right click and say all children, we just said get that specific item, so it's already set to do none. Since we're doing it like that, it's actually not going to delete everything as well. So if we go to deploy and then we go back to the project and we just refresh, you'll see that the items are still there. They haven't been deleted. So that's pretty much it for this session. This is very useful for anybody that's getting started with TDS. It's very important that the initial developer, whoever sets this up, does everything like I've kind of showed in this tutorial. And setting up even the Sitecore items that you're syncing. Typically, when you set up your content folder, you're going to want to just not sync everything. You're just going to want to pick the items that you want, because at some point, when your Sitecore instance goes to production, you're not going to want all your content from production in source control. You're just going to create yourself a ton of headaches, and it's better in that environment to just get backups of your master database from production, move them local, and then you always will have the most recent from production, and then you can develop against that. So that concludes today's session. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me either through the links below, or if you want to, you can always just reach out to me on LinkedIn or any of those channels. I'm happy to help.